United States of America is a constitutional republic. It is the formation of complete sovereignty of all of the civilians concentrated into the Constitution. It is a nation of law, which is separate to the concept actively propagated by insurrections, calling it a nation of laws or some other scam. Now, the construct of the nation of laws is derived by the bureaucracies in order to dismantle and systematically collapse the government, as was strategically understood historically from the ancient Chinese governments, which broke up into its bureaucracies, which then enforced its laws as a nation of laws. And thus, the bureaucrats, having hyper concentrated all of them and then decentralized that power to their wizard bureaucrats, maintained the complete instability of the arrangement and lost all central cohesion, which then broke up the empire into its subparts, forcing them to re-engage in the re-centralization or unifying of China. To this extent, this is the same concept in the United States, as it would break up into the various states and then engage in the renewing of the purges by the Civil War, derivative of the reunifying of the United States into the United States. This, as a strategic position, is the anarchy and civil war, which you would avoid if you were trying to avoid a civil war, which would inhabit the clan activities of the lynch mobs that in the American original Civil War was derivative of forcing all of the black community to fight them, which had more security during the war than they had after the war, as after the war the lynch mobs were able to target them specifically in vulnerable locations, separate to the rest of the reinforcements, allowing them to strategically be dissolved, which would actively be applicable in the new Civil War, derivative of the Confederacy's ability to exist, which is a communist purging, which would engage in these hate crime operations, such as Lindsey Graham's lawfare or Lindsey Graham's hate crimes of economic violence, or any of the others when he's promoting the Confederacy and its operation against the United States in violation of the nation of law, which he is in active rebellion against, along with all of his subordinates in the insurrection, in contempt and hatred of the United States as enemy combatants without a legal government. Now, they, as insurgent terrorists without a legal government, are engaged in these operations as an insurgent terrorist in the Northwoods program called 9/11, which generated the position of the 9/11 terror attack, requiring the vulnerabilities for the plan that they had constructed from scratch, which then materialized their systematic purging or removal of the security mechanisms, making the vulnerability so the plan could happen so that they could hyper-accelerate their already planned outcome in their communist insurrection. Now, to understand this properly, you would have to understand the concept of a republic, which has its various parties and its representatives who were elected, at which point the function of the Soviet Union having derived its ability to generate their proxy war infiltrators for the plot to destroy the United States and the West without firing a single Soviet bullet, materialized in this insurgency, which created the Confederacy in the first place, which is nothing more than white trash creating communism, which has all of the hillbilly taste that you would expect from them. At which point you could always tell a Soviet because they promote Soviet policy. Now, the Soviets had to deal with the fact that the fascists were actively trying to destroy it, at which point their political negotiations required them to engage in the settlement and the promotion as long as they acquired the end goal. All of the particular potential wealth derived by the exchanges otherwise had to be given to the others, at which point the settlement became mostly fascist, a little bit communist, which would then promote all of the William Barr unitary executive theory type fascist bullshit, such as Scalia's position in the position that the judiciary does not have authority over the position of the policies, as the Constitution is not above the inferior law, as superior is clearly below inferior, and therefore, since superior is below inferior, then you have to share their definitions in order to share the functional benefits. And thus, the function of calling out the dynamic is actively subverted in their talking out of both sides of their mouth bullshit, which then materializes the terrorist operations by their Soviet magic, which, having been exponentially studied in their plot and of all historic magics, which historically, presumably according to myth, would have had additional machines and technologies not understood, and therefore they only have the machinery that they have available in order to reproduce the inferior variants of that same magic, which presumably, according to the mythos, would have also have automatically existed and had been created as a subordinate function, as a subpart of the greater magic with the larger machinery. To this extent, the understanding of the insurrections on the basis of the policy is derivative for the representation of the Soviet Union's insurrection, which, having been concealed by its hated enemies, the fascists, has already been accepted and therefore is the continuation of the insurrection, which by law purges all officers who've supported the insurrection, which includes the president's, to be barred from the government or to receive any benefit, including Social Security, and certainly, above all else, does not have a right to vote. Now, in promotion of this insurrection, they have targeted the functional elites, which, having created all of the powers of the government for their insurrections, generated their secrecy powers, which then, having calculated the position, have the criminal intention of the obstruction of an officer in his official proceedings, which they believe to have been David Bull's from the very beginning, as the legend of David Company would have had all of his subordinate faculties essential, which would have historically already been active, which they had been targeting and dismantling systematically in criminal actions that the government is obligated to correct it against and restore. This then generates the position of their various mechanisms, such as the actions of seizures or takings. And thus the function of having seized the faculties requires the government to have held it and been responsible for it, and is responsible to return the seized asset. If they had sold the asset, they still have to return it as a takings, paying the original value in the obstructed compounding interest specifically aligned to it as a specific purchase, and therefore return it in its entirety. Now, the government having been done so by it having been convinced by the insurgents to do the insurrection, allowed for it to be dismantled in the destruction of the essentials. As an insurgent coming in and seizing a particular thing temporarily as an essential security mechanism would, as an insurgent, try and destroy the thing once it's put off in the non-secure location, away from protecting the vital organs which needed to be protected, and therefore allowed for its destruction, and therefore have engaged in that function as a subversion to national security, as an enemy combatant, as an individual without a legal government, operating as a terrorist insurgent. To this end, has engaged in the function of all of the compounding interests in the liabilities of the gross negligence side effects of the absence of that security, which includes 9/11, which they are specifically guilty of. This then generates a federal debt that they have compounded exponentially as their company of collaborators in their secret society, which has not filed the paperwork, would still, by definition, track and compel them in their entirety to pay the entirety of the federal debt, which they may not legally escape from. This, of course, puts a delay on the function of David collecting any of those values, which then requires the government to still return the faculties in its entirety, but is delayed by this inconvenience, which then generates all of the nonsense, which presumably would force David to take a large loan out from the Fed or whoever in order to engage in having the proper liquidation coverage is essential for those security functions, which means, by definition, while restrained, David has too many things. He's overwhelmed with things to do, but he doesn't have the mechanisms to be able to perform any of the services which he's being obstructed from as they dick around and play their nonsensical game in the goals to collapse the government as an enemy of the nation and as a public enemy has put everyone in danger by having not been arrested, uh, as their act of freedom is an insufferable injury to the general public's safety, as they engage in their hate crimes against the general public, protected by their insurrectionist insurgents, who, having compromised many offices such as the judiciary, have covered for their crimes in the collapse of society. Now, one would have to actively study history and its various components in order to understand what to expect from them, and thus the function of the Gulag Archipelago, or any of the other studies of the nature of their party's secret empire and what it is after as the status quo norm, would verify everything that you could expect in the future to suffer if they are not utterly eradicated, and thus the function of the ability to do law enforcement or national security is hinged and contingent on the enforcement of breaking them apart and engaging in that enforcement of eradication. Thus, the full extermination of the threat is in the constitutional obligation for all American soldiers to destroy all threats, foreign and domestic, all being completely inclusive and without exception, and therefore they can't say, but I don't want to because this one's inconvenient, or it's like, really hard, guys. Not really a position, not really a thing, and therefore the function of being able to fight the insurgents understood according to the threat, which was supposed to be the specialty of the United States military when engaged in the war on terror. It was supposed to have hyper-accelerated the training against insurgency, as terrorist insurgency was supposed to be a specialty, and thus the function of a sniper is a specialty, the function of a SWAT breaking into urban society, an urban dwelling, is a specialty. This is supposed to be a specialty, guys. You have to specifically have actually been good at it. To this end, it is understood that everyone who engages in the government has to do so as a sober, educated answer, or they cannot submit things to the record, and there are entire processes in order to vet and disqualify it. Say, for instance, if a cop engages in the function of attempted law enforcement and does not participate in all of the prerequisite conditions essential for the service of law to be enforced, would then maintain a disqualification of themselves or the case as a whole. And to do that, they then would get thrown out of the case or compromise the case unless the insurgency has fully encompassed the entirety of the court, which is little more than window dressing after that point, such as the We Own the Streets propaganda film from Skip Intro, which then materializes the function of what it means to be systematically subjugated to a collapsing society infected by the disease of the white supremacist communism.